Smoke poured from the Sherman's turret. Flames licked the sky. Its 75mm gun was useless, jammed at the breech. The tank commander had bailed. 2 crewmen were dead. The Germans were closing in fast, 250 infantry supported by machine guns and mortars, storming the hill outside Metz, France. Every Allied soldier had either retreated or been killed. Everyone except one, Private First Class Elijah B. Wilson, a black Marine tank mechanic who wasn't even supposed to be in combat. But with no orders and no command, Elijah climbed into the burning Sherman, wrapped his hands in burlap, and slammed the hatch shut. What he did next wasn't taught in training. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't even sane. But within 60 minutes, the Germans were retreating. Bodies littered the hillside. And Wilson, covered in soot and blood, stood alone atop a smoldering tank, having stopped an entire assault with nothing but grit, engine oil, and one crazy idea no one believed could work. Before we dive deeper into the story, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from today? Hill 139 wasn't supposed to be a battlefield. It was a logistical waypoint, just a mound of earth overlooking a cold November valley near Metz, France. On the morning of November 14th, it was mostly quiet, occupied by a patchwork of Marines who weren't trained to fight. Fuel truck drivers, motor pool mechanics, quartermasters, and clerks. They'd been posted there to manage the backflow of supplies heading toward the real fight east of the Moselle River. But by noon, the front had collapsed, and the war had come to them. German infantry, 250 men from the 11th Panzer Grenadier Division, were pushing back with force, clawing through the Allied line in desperate waves. Metz was more than just a city. It was a fortress, an ancient barrier standing between Patton's push into Germany and Hitler's last hopes in the West. The Americans had thrown everything at it, tanks, air power, men, and still it held. That's why Hill 139 mattered. Whoever controlled it could fire down into the Southern Access Road, the only corridor left for retreating Allied convoys. And now, no one was left to defend it, except men who had never been expected to. The Black Marines stranded there weren't frontline troops. They'd been issued rifles, yes, but most had never fired them outside of qualification. The military doctrine of the day consigned African American troops to labor and logistics, not combat. Supply, not slaughter, one general had written, as if war could be neatly divided by color. Even the Marine Corps had been reluctant to accept black recruits, only opening its doors 2 years earlier under pressure from the White House. Those who made it through boot camp were sent to segregated units like the 51st Defense Battalion or the ammunition companies that served the front by staying far behind it. Elijah B. Wilson had arrived at Metz 3 weeks earlier with the 6th Marine Depot Company, a support unit attached to the Army's 3rd Division. His job was tank recovery and field maintenance, patch up the Shermans and get them rolling again. He'd never been issued a sidearm, he carried a wrench. That morning, he'd been working beneath a damaged M4A3 when the first shells fell. The German assault began with indirect fire. Mortar rounds stitched the ridgeline, walking steadily toward the hilltop encampment. It was meant to disorient, not destroy. Then came the shriek of MG-42s and the crack of bolt-action Mausers. American command had already withdrawn. Orders to fall back had come at dawn. But no one had told the Marines on Hill 139. Their radios had gone silent after a direct hit on the relay truck. The men there were cut off, alone, and suddenly responsible for holding a piece of ground no one thought they'd have to fight for. Chaos exploded across the encampment. Fuel drums went up in oily fireballs. A supply truck jackknifed, blocking the only path down the hill. 2 Shermans were hit before they could even turn their turrets. One of them was Elijah's. The tank took a glancing shell to the front glacis, killing the commander instantly. The loader panicked and ran, was cut down by rifle fire before he reached the tree line. Elijah watched it all from beneath the burning wreckage, heart pounding, fingers slick with grease and fear. Somewhere above him, a .50 cal chattered, and then fell silent. All around him, men were scattering, some trying to fight, some trying to hide. But no one was winning. The hill had become a trap. Smoke choked the air, and the stench of cordite and gasoline mixed with blood. As the Germans advanced, tightening the noose, something ancient stirred inside Wilson. Not rage, not glory. Something quieter. Something that whispered, "If no one else is going to stop them, you will." Elijah B. Wilson had never planned to be a soldier. Not really. He was born in rural Georgia in the spring of 1923, the son of a sharecropper and a midwife. His hands knew soil before they ever knew steel. But from a young age, Elijah showed an instinct for machinery. By 12, he was fixing busted tractor engines with nothing more than baling wire and an oil rag. He dropped out of school at 14 to help on the farm. But when the barn radio crackled with the news of Pearl Harbor, something changed. The world was moving fast, and Elijah wanted to move with it. Not out of patriotism, not at first. He wanted escape, freedom, a life beyond cotton fields and segregation. He lied about his age and enlisted in the Marines. One of the first 1,000 black men to do so after President Roosevelt's executive order forced the Corps to integrate, on paper at least. He trained at Montford Point, North Carolina, the segregated camp the Corps had hastily constructed in the shadow of Camp Lejeune. The barracks were half-finished. The uniforms were hand-me-downs. The rifles were worn out. The message was clear. You're here because we have to take you, not because we want to. Elijah never complained. He kept his head down and learned everything there was to know about engines, transmissions, track systems, and hydraulic lines. By 1944, he could strip down a Sherman engine in under 3 hours and put it back together running smoother than factory spec. He never questioned orders, never asked for recognition. He figured his skill was enough. The Corps figured he'd never need to use it in combat. His posting to Metz came as part of a logistics detachment tasked with maintaining tanks and recovery vehicles on the fringe of the front. His days were spent under chassis, his nights cleaning grease from his fingernails by lantern light. White officers rarely spoke to him unless something was broken. "Keep 'em rolling, Wilson," was the most praise he ever got. Among the black Marines, though, he was respected. Quiet, dependable, and serious. They called him Doc, not because he had medical training, but because he could bring machines back from the dead. Elijah wasn't flashy, wasn't loud. He just worked. He believed in doing the job right, even when no one noticed, especially when no one noticed. His relationships with white officers were transactional at best. He knew better than to expect fairness. The Corps gave him tools and assignments, never trust or authority. He didn't eat in the same mess, didn't bunk in the same tents. Even in war, the color line held firm. But among his own, he carried weight. When he spoke, others listened. When something couldn't be fixed, they brought it to him. And when the shooting started on Hill 139, they looked to him. Not for orders, but for calm, for presence. And that's what Elijah gave them, even when the world turned upside down. Even when the flames rose and the men ran and the radios went silent, Elijah didn't panic. He didn't run. He did what he'd always done: assess the machine, understand what's broken, and find a way to make it work. Only this time, the machine wasn't a tank. It was the battlefield itself. And Elijah B. Wilson was about to take hold of it with his bare, oil-slicked hands. Sherman tank 422 should have been a tomb. It had taken a direct hit to the front plate, low enough to spare the engine, but high enough to shatter the turret's traverse gear. The breech was cracked. The main gun was jammed at 0 elevation. A useless cannon pointed straight at the dirt. The commander had been decapitated by shrapnel. The loader bled out before anyone could pull him free. The coaxial .30 caliber had run dry in the first burst. No one with sense would have tried to fight in it. But Elijah wasn't looking for sense. He was looking for function. And what he saw beneath the smoke and wreckage was potential. The powertrain was intact. The right track still responded to throttle. And nestled on the hull's starboard flank, attached just 2 weeks earlier as part of an experimental retrofit, was the real key: a Mark I E1 auxiliary flamethrower. Short-range, volatile, unreliable, and technically not even supposed to be fielded yet. But it worked, and Elijah knew how to make it scream. Crawling through the busted side hatch, he slid over blood-slick steel and burning upholstery. He wrapped a rag around his mouth to keep out the smoke. The interior was a furnace, blackened, choking, lit by flickering electrical sparks. But the engine gauges were green. Battery voltage was stable. Fuel at 40%. He reached for the ignition, and the motor kicked once, twice, then roared to life like a wounded animal. The whole hull vibrated. The tank wasn't dead. It was angry. With one hand on the clutch and the other on the throttle lever, Elijah shifted into neutral and began his work. The flamethrower line had ruptured near the nozzle. He patched it with a strip of oil-soaked canvas and wired it tight with a piece of bent radio antenna. For ignition, he rewired the electrical spark unit to a flare housing, stripped from a dead Marine's grenade belt. Next, he pulled 2 smoke grenades from a shattered ammo crate, wedged them into the side viewports, and rigged a field wire to yank both pins from inside the driver's compartment. When he pulled that wire, the tank would vent smoke like a wounded dragon. But fire and smoke weren't enough. Elijah needed fear. The Germans were cresting the lower slope now, scouts in loose skirmish lines, feeling for weakness. He could hear the metallic rattle of gear, the clipped barks of shouted commands. They didn't expect resistance. They expected cleanup. Elijah gritted his teeth. He twisted the flamethrower's nozzle toward the brush line and feathered the trigger. A blast of fire jetted out, short and erratic, but hot. The flames danced across the underbrush, caught on dry leaves and diesel spill, and leapt into a roaring curtain. German soldiers scattered. He pulled the smoke wire. The grenades hissed to life, choking the viewport with thick gray clouds. From the outside, it would look like the tank was firing from all positions. From the inside, it was nearly blind. But that didn't matter. Elijah wasn't aiming. He was signaling. He jerked the throttle, kicked the tank forward 10 feet, then reversed, then forward again. Just enough to make it look alive, to make it feel manned, to convince the enemy that this was no wreck. It was a sentry, a trap, maybe the first in a series. He was counting on confusion, on hesitation, counting on their fear of what they didn't know. Alone inside a burning coffin, he created the illusion of a full mechanized defense. And as the German vanguard faltered, spread out, and began shouting over each other in panic, Elijah adjusted his grip on the flamethrower trigger, narrowed his eyes behind smoke-stung lids, and prepared to make them believe a broken tank could still kill. Elijah's hands were shaking as he gripped the trigger handle, burlap gloves smoking at the seams. The metal was blistering hot, and blood from a cut on his palm had soaked through the fabric, mixing with oil. He could barely see through the haze inside the tank, but the rhythm of the engine steadied him, the rough, mechanical heartbeat of something barely alive. He slammed the ignition lever forward, and the world outside erupted. The flamethrower spat out a cone of burning fuel 30 yards long, igniting the hillside in a sudden wall of orange and black. The Germans scattered, shouting over the roar. For a moment, Elijah saw them through the periscope, silhouettes flailing against firelight, ducking behind rocks, trying to regroup. To them, it must have looked like a coordinated ambush. No one would believe one man was running a crippled Sherman by himself. That was the power of deception, fear magnified by imagination. Elijah understood it instinctively. He'd seen it before, when a farm animal panicked at a shadow, when a small spark set a whole field ablaze. War wasn't just bullets and armor, it was psychology, and he was about to turn it into a weapon. He shifted the tank's gears in deliberate rhythm. Reverse, neutral, forward, brake. From the outside, it mimicked tactical repositioning, like a full crew was maneuvering for line-of-sight advantage. The grinding tracks and revving engine echoed through the valley, making it seem like multiple tanks were alive and repositioning. He followed each motion with a burst of fire, short and erratic, never predictable. That unpredictability was what unnerved them. Soldiers are trained to read patterns, to find order in chaos, but Elijah was making chaos the pattern. Between bursts, he killed the engine briefly, letting the silence stretch, then reignited it with a deafening roar. Each ignition made it sound like reinforcements arriving. The smoke grenades still hissed, pouring thick plumes that turned daylight into an infernal fog. Through it, the Germans fired blindly, wasting ammunition, hitting nothing but their own confusion. Elijah used every second to breathe, to think, to time his next move. He had no illusions about surviving the hour. His lungs burned, his skin peeled, his body screamed from heat. But he wasn't trying to live forever. He was trying to buy time. Every minute he kept the Germans guessing was another minute for the retreating Americans to regroup behind Metz. Another minute for supply convoys to escape artillery range. He didn't know it then, but his crazy idea was holding an entire company at bay. He began using sound as a weapon. When the flamethrower's pressure started to drop, he banged a wrench against the hull to mimic returning fire, punctuating the noise with blasts of smoke from the viewport grenades. He wanted the enemy to think the hill was still fortified, still defended by an organized force. Fear spread faster than fire ever could. The Germans started yelling orders that contradicted each other, one officer shouting to advance, another to flank, another to fall back. Elijah smiled through soot-blackened lips. Confusion was victory. He kept moving the tank in small jerks, angling it toward the burned-out trucks, using the debris for cover and reflecting light off the flames to make it seem like gunfire. It wasn't tactics, it was theater, the kind only desperation could inspire. The ground outside hissed with rain as the November drizzle returned, turning ash to mud. Steam rose around the tank, blending with smoke until it looked spectral, otherworldly. And still the Germans hesitated. That hesitation saved lives. For 60 minutes, Elijah turned illusion into defense, fear into firepower. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was the ghost of Hill 139, and the enemy had no idea they were fighting smoke, steel, and a single man who refused to die. Elijah B. Wilson fought like a ghost, wrapped in steel, surrounded by heat, smoke, and the screaming teeth of war. For a full hour, 60 crawling, punishing minutes, he stayed locked inside Sherman Tank 422, orchestrating an illusion of life from a dead machine. Every move he made was calculated to create the impression of a coordinated defense. He would rotate the jammed turret by hand, using a bent pry bar to inch the barrel left, then right, then back again, making it seem like someone inside was tracking targets. He changed engine tempo constantly, revving hard, cutting it, sputtering it to life again, playing the mechanical equivalent of breathing. At times, he cracked the hatch just enough to toss out empty shell casings he'd scavenged from the deck, letting them clatter loudly against the hull. From afar, it sounded like active gunners reloading. Every burst from the flamethrower was timed, not too often, not too rhythmic, just enough to keep the Germans guessing. Wilson had no fire support, no map, no backup. He was improvising every second in a burning box surrounded by death. His ears rang from the pounding of German mortars, machine gun rounds stitched across the tank's exterior, rattling like hail. One shell struck the right tread, locking it, forcing Elijah to switch to pivot maneuvers using only the left track. He adjusted, adapted, compensated, because the moment he stopped moving, the illusion died. And with it, so would he. But the illusion wasn't the only thing crumbling. Inside the tank, the air was toxic. Smoke from the electrical system curled through every vent. The stench of scorched metal and burned flesh clung to his nostrils. Sweat rolled down his spine in rivers, stinging open cuts on his hands and forearms. His head throbbed from heat exhaustion. His eyes burned with tears that had nothing to do with emotion. Time blurred. Seconds stretched into minutes. He couldn't tell if it had been 20 minutes or 50. There were moments he screamed just to hear something other than the engine's roar and the hiss of flame. And then he'd go quiet again, lips trembling, teeth clenched, rocking slightly in place, as if the tank itself might steady his mind. He thought about the men he'd seen die that morning, the tank commander whose blood still coated the hatch, the loader who didn't make it 10 feet. He thought about home, too. Georgia. The sound of cicadas in late summer. The taste of cold well water. He wondered if he'd ever feel that again. But even those thoughts grew distant, muffled beneath the roaring madness of the present. Pain stitched through his ribs. Shrapnel from a near hit had punched through the floor plate and embedded in his side. He couldn't feel how deep it was anymore. His breathing was shallow, ragged. His gloved hands, caked in soot and blood, had gone numb. The burlap fused to his palms. A sharp crack overhead signaled a ricochet, or maybe a direct hit. He didn't flinch. Couldn't. The tank jolted, bucked, then settled. He blinked, adjusted the throttle, and spat blood onto the floor. Then he fired the flamethrower again, just to remind the enemy he was still alive. Outside, the Germans were stalled. Every attempt to flank had failed under fire. Their officers barked orders, but none wanted to be first into the inferno. From the outside, it looked like a strong point, maybe more tanks behind it, maybe infantry dug in. None could believe it was just one man, bleeding out slowly in a burning shell, holding a hill no one ordered him to defend. Elijah B. Wilson had become something more than a Marine. For 1 hour in hell, he was the battlefield itself. And yet, back at battalion command nearly 6 miles behind the front, no one believed Elijah B. Wilson was still alive. The last transmission from Hill 139 had come just before sunrise, A garbled message from a junior officer reporting that the hill was being shelled and enemy forces were advancing fast. Then, silence. HQ chalked it up to the obvious. The hill had been overrun. A supply post held by non-combat personnel wasn't expected to last more than 10 minutes against an organized German assault, let alone an hour. When junior officers suggested dispatching reinforcements to reclaim the position or evacuate the wounded, they were met with clipped rejections. Resources were stretched thin. There were more valuable positions to defend. And quietly, beneath the surface of every decision, lay something unspoken but deeply understood. Hill 139 had been manned mostly by Black Marines. Support crew, mechanics, men without combat stripes or command clout, men whose deaths, in the eyes of some, would not change the outcome of the war. Racism in the ranks wasn't new, it was baked into the structure. The Marine Corps had only begun accepting black recruits in 1942, under pressure from the White House, and even then, it did so with resistance. Commanders who had never once visited Montford Point felt no urgency to defend the men trained there. To them, a mechanic like Wilson wasn't a warfighter. He was a wrench in uniform. One staff major reportedly said, "If there's still someone moving on that hill, it's probably a cook in the wrong place." And so, no rescue came. No air cover. No infantry. Not even a reconnaissance jeep. Hill 139 was written off in a single line of the morning report as likely lost. But inside the burning husk of a Sherman tank, Elijah Wilson hadn't read that report. He didn't know he'd been abandoned. All he knew was that he was still alive. And so long as he was alive, the Germans wouldn't take that hill without a fight. Somewhere between the roar of the engine and the numbness creeping into his limbs, something inside him changed. He was no longer a support tech waiting on orders. He wasn't patching tanks for others to drive. He was the weapon now. And the decision to fight wasn't a command. It was a choice. Wilson had crossed an invisible threshold, the kind of moment that can't be seen in the heat of it, only after, when the smoke clears. He'd always been told to follow instructions, to stay in his lane, to do his part. But here, in the absence of orders, in the vacuum left by silence and indifference, he'd found something greater than permission. Purpose. The faces of the men who had fallen around him that morning lived behind his eyes. Private Connolly, who had died trying to reconnect a radio line. Corporal Jennings, who was last seen dragging ammo crates toward a cratered foxhole. Wilson wasn't fighting for glory. He wasn't trying to be remembered. He was trying to make their deaths mean something. He was trying to make the enemy pay for every inch of ground they took. With every flame burst, every bluffing maneuver, every growl of the tank's engine, he carved that meaning into the scorched dirt. The world beyond the hill had forgotten him, but Elijah B. Wilson had remembered himself. Not as the Black Marine who fixed broken things, but as the man who refused to be broken. By the time the Germans realized what they were up against, it was too late to make sense of it. They had thrown 3 separate assaults at Hill 139 in less than an hour, and lost each one to fire, smoke, and madness. The officers on the ground reported multiple tanks, at least 2, maybe more, backed by infantry with flamethrowers. In truth, there was only one dying Sherman and one man inside it. The illusion had worked too perfectly. The German commander, a veteran of North Africa, could not comprehend that a single vehicle was holding his entire company at bay. His intelligence officers had briefed him that the Americans were in retreat, disorganized, broken. But the hill said otherwise. It roared, breathed, and burned like a dragon defending its nest. He ordered a withdrawal to regroup and call for artillery support, convinced they were caught in an ambush. They left behind 37 dead, nearly twice as many wounded, and a field littered with scorched rifles, shattered helmets, and half-melted machine guns. The air reeked of burned cloth and cordite. When the last of the Germans fell back down the slope, the hillside went eerily still. The only sound left was the crackling of smoldering earth and the low, rumbling cough of the tank's dying engine. Elijah slumped forward over the controls, barely conscious. The Germans' retreat was more than a tactical failure. It was a psychological collapse. Fire did that to men. It stripped away reason. Historians would later write that flamethrowers were among the most feared weapons of the war, not because of the range or the casualties they caused, but because of what they did to the human mind. Soldiers could brace themselves against bullets. They could hide from shells. But fire turned the battlefield into a nightmare. It melted steel, devoured oxygen, and erased the line between safety and death. It made brave men crawl. The German troops who faced Elijah that morning hadn't expected flame. They had expected bullets. The sight of a Sherman tank vomiting liquid fire across the hilltop shattered their sense of control. Some fled screaming. Others froze where they stood. And when they saw the tank move, forward, back, side to side, they imagined dozens more hidden in the smoke. Wilson's madness had become their reality. They fought ghosts, and ghosts cannot be killed. When American reconnaissance finally reached Hill 139 2 days later, they found the aftermath of that illusion. The hill was black and pitted with craters, the grass burned away to ash. The Sherman's armor was blistered and warped. The barrel drooped, the hull half collapsed. The machine looked more like a carcass than a vehicle. But inside, they found signs of the battle that words could never capture. Bloody handprints on the levers, a bent wrench fused to the throttle, a prayer scrawled in soot across the hatch. Hold the line. Outside the tank, they counted the bodies of enemy soldiers scattered across the slope. Many were found with their rifles unfired, as if they'd never managed to raise them. The ground told the story better than any report could. A single tank had held the hill. A single man had changed the course of that morning's fight. The officers at HQ dismissed it at first, calling it a miscommunication or a lucky fluke. But the survivors who examined the site knew better. They could feel it in the silence that hung over the ridge, the kind of silence that only comes after something extraordinary. Hill 139 had been lost, then saved by a ghost in a burning tank, and even in death, that ghost still guarded the ground. It refused to surrender. 4 hours after the smoke cleared and the German troops had vanished beyond the ridge, a squad of American infantry finally reached the hill. They moved slowly, rifles at the ready, expecting to find corpses, perhaps booby traps, perhaps nothing. What they didn't expect was movement inside the Sherman. Private Elijah B. Wilson was still alive, barely. Slumped over the driver's controls, unconscious from smoke inhalation, his uniform blackened, gloves fused to his skin. His breathing was shallow. One medic peeled the burlap from his hands and muttered, "Jesus Christ," under his breath. And then came the question, sharp and immediate, as if it couldn't wait another second. From the platoon lieutenant, boots still clean, voice taut with disbelief. "Who told you to do that? No congratulations. No commendation. Just a demand for accountability." Because what Wilson had done broke every rule. Unauthorized use of a combat vehicle, violation of command protocol, field modification of a weapon system. Never mind that it had saved the hill. The white officers standing over him didn't know what to make of it. They circled the tank like it might bite. Inside the smoldering hull, they saw chaos, rewired systems, field-rigged flame controls, empty smoke grenades, and a blood-soaked man slumped like he had wrestled a machine into submission and barely survived. They asked again, "Who gave you permission?" Wilson couldn't answer. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, lips cracked, lungs rattling. What followed was silence. And then, bureaucracy. The incident was reported up the chain, but not celebrated. A preliminary summary described it as an improvised action by a support technician during chaotic circumstances. No medal, no recommendation. The official battle report omitted his name entirely. It mentioned unexpected resistance and enemy withdrawal likely due to misjudged Allied strength. The brass couldn't allow a black mechanic, a non-combatant, to be the hero of a stand that leadership had already written off. That would mean admitting the chain of command had failed, and that someone outside the system had succeeded. The report was filed, buried, forgotten, but not by the men who knew. Among the Black Marines stationed near Metz, Elijah's name spread like wildfire. Word of his stand passed from bunk to bunk, from foxhole to mess hall. Some called it insanity, others called it salvation. All of them called it true. One survivor from the 6th Depot Company, Corporal Moses Grady, wrote in his letter home, "We thought he was dead, but he was fire." Even some white Marines who had arrived with the reinforcements began telling the story. Quietly at first, then with a kind of awe. They hadn't seen a man. They had seen a tank refuse to die. And when they learned there had only been one person inside it, they didn't speak for a long time. Not every Marine believed it. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, wartime legend. But those who had climbed that hill, who had seen the bodies, the burn scars on the earth, the Sherman still warm with life, it stayed with them. Because deep down, they knew what they had witnessed wasn't madness. It was conviction, made visible. In the weeks that followed, Elijah was transferred to a field hospital far from the front. He said little, asked for less, and when they told him he'd receive no official recognition for what he'd done, he nodded slowly. Wasn't doing it for them, he said. Did it for the ones who didn't make it. That was enough. Because for the men who did make it off that hill alive, Elijah B. Wilson would never be a footnote. He was the reason they lived to fight another day. Elijah B. Wilson never received a medal for what he did on Hill 139. No citation, no commendation, no line in the official record. When the war ended and the men of the 3rd Division returned home, his name didn't appear in any after-action reports or military newsletters. The paperwork had vanished somewhere in the chain of command, reduced to an unauthorized engagement fought by an unnamed mechanic. To the brass, it was easier that way. Recognition meant rewriting the story of Metz, admitting that a segregated unit's Black Marine had done what no one else could or would. In 1945, America, that kind of hero, didn't fit the narrative. While white officers who had never fired a shot that day returned home with medals pinned to their uniforms, Elijah stepped off the train in Georgia wearing a plain jacket, carrying a duffel bag that still smelled faintly of oil and smoke. There was no parade waiting for him, no reporter with a notebook. Just the same red clay roads, the same signs that read, "Whites Only," the same quiet reminders that victory overseas did not mean freedom at home. He found work fixing tractors again, the same machines he'd left behind before the war. Neighbors called him Mr. Wilson. but few knew what he had done. When asked about the war, he only said, "I did my part," and left it there. The world moved on, and his story slipped between the cracks. Yet among the men who had served near Metz, the legend of the burning tank refused to die. It passed from barracks to bar stools, from one veteran to another, always told with the same hush, half disbelief, half reverence. They called him the man inside the fire, or sometimes just the ghost in the Sherman. No one could agree on how many Germans he'd stopped, how long he'd held out, or even his full name. Some thought he'd been killed in action. Others swore they'd seen him afterward, sitting quietly in a mess tent with bandaged hands, staring into his coffee like he was still seeing flames. That was how oral history works. It grows roots in the silences where truth should have been written. Black veterans, in particular, carried the story as a kind of secret inheritance. For them, it wasn't just about one man's courage, it was proof. Proof that they had fought, bled, and saved lives in a war that so often refused to see them. At reunions years later, when old men with silver hair and faded uniforms gathered to remember, someone would always bring up Metz. And the room would go quiet. Then someone would say, "You remember that tank?" And the others would nod. The details changed, but the meaning never did. Elijah's defiance became a mirror of everything they'd endured. The orders ignored, the dignity denied, the heroism unseen. In the absence of medals, they gave him memory. In the absence of history books, they gave him story. And sometimes, that's stronger. One Marine, who later became a schoolteacher, said in a letter decades later, "What he did reminded us that we weren't fighting for their praise. We were fighting for each other." That was Elijah's invisible legacy, the idea that heroism doesn't need witnesses to be real. His act on Hill 139 wasn't written down in any archive, but it lived in the way those men carried themselves after the war, with quiet pride, with the knowledge that someone who looked like them had stood alone against 250 soldiers and won. Elijah Wilson may have come home to a segregated South that tried to erase him, but history, even when it's buried, has a way of smoldering. His story burned quietly, passed from voice to voice, refusing to die, just like the man who lit the fire and held the hill. Elijah B. Wilson died in 1992, age 68. The obituary in the Macon Telegraph was 2 sentences long. Elijah Wilson, Marine Corps veteran, World War II. Survived by his wife, Lillian, and 2 children. That was it. No mention of Metz, no mention of Hill 139, or the tank that became a fortress, or the fire that made a man into legend. Just a name, a date, a war. The kind of ending too many men like him received. Quiet, unrecorded, folded into the larger story of a nation that was too busy celebrating victory to remember who made it possible. But a single photograph survived. Elijah in his grease-stained coveralls, one hand resting on the side of Sherman 422, a faint smile cutting through the exhaustion. On the back, in faded pencil, it read, "Metz, 44. We held." That picture, passed down through family and friends, is all that's left of the man who bought 60 minutes of history with his bare hands. Forgotten heroism has a way of echoing beneath the surface of time. Even when it isn't carved into stone or printed in books, it lingers, in the pauses between stories, in the hush that falls when someone mentions Metz and the fire that wouldn't die. For military historians, the engagement on Hill 139 was little more than a tactical anomaly. a 7-hour delay that allowed supply convoys to reroute safely through the southern corridor. But that delay changed everything. Those extra hours gave Patton's armored divisions the breathing room to reorganize, refuel, and re-engage in the push toward the Saar. Without it, the left flank might have folded, and the German counterattack near Metz could have succeeded. The official records call it enemy hesitation due to misjudged American strength. The truth is simpler. One man inside one tank terrified 250 soldiers into retreat. That's the kind of math history doesn't like to admit. And yet, the soil outside Metz still remembers. If you walk that hill today, you can still see the scorched outline where the Sherman burned. Locals call it Le Mont Noir, the Black Hill, not knowing the irony. Wild grass grows there now, bending in the same wind that once carried the smell of gasoline and cordite. Sometimes, after rain, bits of shrapnel rise to the surface, small, twisted pieces of steel that once sang under fire. They are fragments of the hour that changed everything. Wilson's act wasn't about glory. It was about defiance, the kind born from generations who were told they didn't belong, who were given tools instead of weapons, and still found a way to fight. That's why his story matters. Because the measure of a soldier isn't the medal on his chest, it's what he does when no one's watching. Elijah didn't hold that hill for recognition. He held it because it was the right thing to do, because somewhere inside him a voice said, "If I don't, no one will." That voice has carried farther than any report ever could. Among the veterans who knew him, the phrase, "one tank, one man, 1 hour," became a kind of prayer, a way of saying that courage doesn't ask permission, it just acts. And maybe that's the legacy we need to remember most. History forgets the names of the quiet ones, the mechanics, the drivers, the cooks, the medics, the ones who didn't wear rank but bore the weight of it anyway. But the ground remembers, and somewhere, beneath the grass and silence of Hill 139, a whisper remains. 1 tank, 1 man, 1 hour, and a world forever changed.